Everyone and their mom is using n8n to build AI agents right now. It is the most popular topic on my channel, and rightly so. It is just so incredibly easy to use n8n to build simple yet powerful AI agents without having to write any code. The problem is, most of the time, you can't just build an agent with n8n and call it good. You actually need a front end for yourself and other users to interact with your agent in a clean and simple way. Sure, you could just use the n8n chat widget that it gives you for your agents, but most of the time you need something much more to actually have a good user experience. So today I'm going to show you how to use my favorite combo to build incredible and secure interfaces for your AI agents that you can literally create and deploy in an afternoon. And the best part is you don't have to create a full React or Next.js project like you would with V0, and you really don't have to code anything because we are going to have the LLM do that for us. I know it is a shocker that I'm not using V0 here, but I think you'll like how neatly this works out. There is a time and place to use V0 and also decode a front end yourself, but that is a discussion for another video. Right now, we just want something quick and awesome, and that is using the combo of Claude, Streamlit, and Supabase. Why this combo? Well, let me tell you really quick. First of all, Streamlit. It's a Python package that makes it super easy to build websites. No need for JavaScript at all. And then Claude is really, really good at coding with Streamlit. And I know that Claude in general is already really good at coding. It is insane even considering that. And then we tie it all together with Supabase for easy authentication. And there's a good chance that you're already using Supabase for your n8n agents anyway for things like your chat memory and RAG. So I'll start by showing you how to use Claude to create a basic Streamlit interface for the n8n agent without authentication. I'll show you the n8n workflow as well for the agent and how you have to set it up to make it accessible to the front end. Then we'll go back to using Claude again to add Supabase authentication, both to the front end and the back end with n8n. So without further ado, let's dive in. So starting in Claude, we're going to put in the first prompt to create the basic version of the Streamlit app without authentication. Now, all the prompts that I'm using here, as well as all the code that I generate and tweak, and all the n8n workflows are going to be in a link in the description below to a GitHub repository. So you can just take everything that I've developed right here and use it for yourself to have a really good starting point. And so the first prompt that I have here is create a basic Streamlit application with a chat interface to talk to an LLM. And I also, this is really, really important, I specify what it looks like to actually chat with the LLM and when and how to use this webhook. Also, one thing that I want to mention is I have very basic authentication here with a hard-coded bearer token. And so this isn't using Supabase authentication. It's not robust and you shouldn't use this in production, but I still want a little bit of protection so that people can't just access my n8n workflow and suck my LLM credits. And so that's just an important note there. And then I also get really specific with how to use this webhook because it's a post request and it needs specific items in the payload to work with the n8n workflow. Specifically, I need to pass in the session ID, which is what n8n uses for chat history, and I'll show that workflow in a little bit here. And then also the chat input, that's the second parameter in the payload. That obviously just has the user prompt from the interface. And then the response is also really important. I have to tell Claude that there's a output key from the response JSON, and that's what contains what I get back from the LLM that I need to display back out to the user. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and Claude is just going to chug right through all of this code. It does it so fast. It'll open up the code on the right like we see here, and this is looking perfect. So we got a couple of placeholders that we have to fill in, and I'll do that in a little bit when I bring this code into my Visual Studio Code IDE. We generate a random session ID for chat memory. We have this function here that sends a request to the LLM and gets the response back with all the headers and using the output key, everything that I specified. This is perfect. And then in the main function here, we set up our Streamlit user interface with the chat input. And then whenever we get input, we are going to add it to our user interface, get a response from the LLM, and then output that as well. Super simple, but this is working perfectly. And so now really quickly, I'm going to show you what you need to do in n8n to make this work with a webhook. And then we'll also dive into actually getting this code up and running. All right, so here I am now in my n8n workflow where I have fully built out a RAG AI agent that I've also made accessible to my front end. And so I just want to say that in a separate video on my channel, which you can see above, I have fully built out this agent. So if you're curious how I did that, feel free to check it out. I'm not going to go into detail on everything here because I want to just focus on how to integrate the n8n agent with the front end, making it accessible through a webhook. And so let me dive into that right now. I'll zoom in to where we get the triggers for our agent. And typically when you create an agent with n8n, you're going to have a when chat message received trigger. This is what gives you this chat widget in the bottom middle where you can interact with your agent within the workflow UI. And also, if I click on more info, you get the embed codes that you can embed for a nice little chat widget. That's all fine, but I obviously want a webhook so that I can interact with this through APIs in my front end. And the way that you do that is you simply add a webhook trigger at the start, just like we have the when chat message received trigger, and then you add a respond to webhook at the very end, right after the tools agent. Just these two nodes. That is it. It is super, super simple, but obviously I still want to cover this for you because it's important to get it right. And I'll also talk about the webhook as well because there's a couple of things that are really important to keep in mind here. First of all, your production URL will be active as long as your n8n workflow is toggled to active in the top right. So this is the URL that you're going to put in to fill in the placeholder in the Python code. So Claude gives us a placeholder for the webhook URL. That is this, and that is controlled by the path here. Also for the authentication, you want to select a header auth. And again, we're going to use Supabase later, but this is just for super basic authentication. And then for the credentials, you can click on create new credential. And then right here, the name, you want it to be authorization because that is the name for bearer token keys in our API calls. And then for the value here, you're going to put bearer with a capital B, space, and then the name of your token. And we'll see this when we go into the Python code exactly what that looks like, but you want that to match exactly with what you see here. I'm obviously not going to show my password here, but yeah, authorization and then bearer space and then your token. And so I'm going to close out of this because I obviously have mine set up already. And then to respond, you want to change it from immediately to using respond to webhook node because we add that here at the end. And what this is going to do, you don't have to change anything. It's going to, by default, take the output items from the previous node, which obviously includes the output key from the LLM, and it's going to return that back to the webhook request. And so that's how we get the response from the LLM as a response to the API call. So with that, that is literally everything. So we can now save it and then go over to implement our Python code in our IDE, fill in the placeholders, and then run it and test it. Another thing that I want to mention really quickly, we had the payload with session ID and chat input, because if I go into the edit fields here, what I do is I have this work for both the when chat message receive trigger and the webhook trigger. So this is the value that I have for the when chat message received, the chat widget trigger. But if it doesn't exist, then I go to the payload from the webhook request. So it's json.body.chat input. And then for the session ID, it is exactly the same. And so that way, no matter if we are triggering from our chat widget or our webhook, we can use both. And those are both going to lead into this edit fields node where we get the chat input and session ID. So that, for example, in the Postgres chat memory, we can use the session ID taken from the previous node, and that's all going to work correctly. So we need those specific keys, chat input and session ID, or the n8n workflow will not work. All right, so with that out of the way, we now have everything that we need to just dump our Python code from Claude into Visual Studio Code, and we've got our front end. And so what I'm going to do here is go into this folder that I'll have in the GitHub repo. This is what I'll link in the description of the video. And I will create a new file here, and I'll just call it n8n YouTube agent, just some kind of random name. I've got a couple other scripts already here, just from when I was testing this earlier. And so now I can just copy and paste from Claude all the code that it gave me. And I'm going to touch literally nothing besides the placeholders that it needs me to fill in here. And so I'm just going to open up another one of these scripts that I already have just so I can copy the webhook URL, which I showed you how to get in n8n, and then the bearer token as well. So this is everything after the bearer space that you set up in your credentials in n8n. So you can see here that it's bearer space and then the token that you set up in n8n. Of course, I'm going to change this after, so you can't just call my workflow and have the credentials for it. That's why I have it hard-coded here. But yeah, that is the only thing I'm going to change. And then there are a couple of packages that you'll have to install with Python as well. So you can follow the instructions from Claude on that. Or I also have a requirements.txt file in this folder here, so you can just do pip install -r requirements.txt and then have the exact same environment as me, because obviously this is working perfectly. And yeah, with that, we can go ahead and run Streamlit to kick off our front end. All right, so to run this script, all I had to do is go into the directory where I have my Python script and then run the command streamlit run and then the name of the script. That instantly opens up an instance of Streamlit in my browser, where I now have this very, very simple chat widget. You can expand this in a million different ways, but we got the bare bones right now, and we can talk to our agent. So this is a full RAG AI agent running as that n8n workflow. And so I can even ask it a question based on the documents that I ingested in one of the previous videos on my channel. So I can say, what are the action items from the 825 meeting? And this is going to make that webhook request, and n8n is pretty fast. I'm using a fast LLM, and so we'll get a response very, very quickly here. There we go. The action items from the meeting are, and then yeah, just some silly stuff that I generated with GPT, but this is looking perfect. And so now we can move on to adding Supabase authentication and making this a lot more robust and secure, something that you can really start to build and actually use in production for your business. So back in Claude, because we are going to do a very similar thing to just enhance this whole Streamlit app to include Supabase authentication. And there's again, a couple of specific things I've added to the prompt for things that I know will help Claude a lot, ways to prevent it from hallucinating. And so I'll go over those very quickly as well. And so within the prompt, I'll just paste this in right here. And I'll say, now update this app to use Supabase for authentication. One thing that it loves to do is have a login tab and not a sign up. So I tell it to do both here. And then I also tell it to use the user's Supabase token as the bearer token for the webhook. So now instead of just having something hard-coded, it's actually going to be a bearer token that we can generate with the Supabase Python library. And so it's going to go out to our Supabase instance and generate a unique bearer token for that user that we can then verify in the backend in n8n that yes, this token is valid and is assigned to this user. And we can even get the user's email and other profile information in the n8n workflow just from the bearer token as well. It's very powerful stuff that is still really easy to use, and so you'll see that in a little bit here. And then I also want to display a couple of pieces of information just to show you how robust this is, like the user email in a left side panel. And then sometimes Claude likes to hallucinate and use features that are deprecated, so I just specified this at the very end here. So with that, I'll go ahead and hit enter, and just like before, it's going to generate all this code very beautifully on the right-hand side here. And it's going to look pretty similar, except it's going to be a lot more robust now. A couple more placeholders that we'll need to fill in for Supabase. Overall, it looks pretty similar. Like the send message to LLM is pretty similar, except we now have a new parameter of the token, which we're going to get dynamically from Supabase once we've actually signed in. Okay, so I had to pause and come back because I needed to figure out exactly where everything was in this code. But once they sign in, that's when the user object is added to the session state, and that's what has the token within it. And so if I scroll down here, when we call the LLM, we're going to get the user from the session state and then call the access token attribute of it, and that is what we give to pass as the bearer token to n8n now. And so yeah, I don't want to dive into this code in a lot of detail, but just looking at it initially, this is looking absolutely perfect. And so now I'm going to quickly show you what you have to do in the n8n workflow to work with this Supabase authentication, and then we'll set it up in Visual Studio Code again and test it out. So back in n8n now, because I want to show you how easy it is to change up this workflow to work with this new Supabase bearer token that is specific to a user, instead of using that single hard-coded authorization bearer token that we set up as a credential in n8n. And so the first very important thing that you need to do is go into the webhook trigger and turn off that authentication, because we're not going to have the webhook do the verification now. It's going to be the step after it because we want to manually handle this new Supabase token. So turn that off. Everything else can remain exactly the same. Now, next up, there's a couple of pieces of information that we need from Supabase, including our project URL and our API key. And you can get both of these in the API settings in Supabase. So you just go to Supabase, click on project settings, and then go to API in the configuration. And you can copy your URL here. I'll show you where to use that in a second. And then for the API key, you can copy, so you can reveal and copy this service role secret. That is your secret Supabase API key that you can't share with anyone. On the other hand, the anonymous API key, this is public. As long as you have row level security defined on your table so people can't just read and write whatever, and you can look that up and look into what it is, then you can share this with anybody. And so that is how we're actually going to have that in the Streamlit UI later. So this is public, and this is your private API key that you want to pass in right here. So I'm going to click into the HTTP request. The headers that we have here to verify the user's bearer token is we have an API key, and this is the secret that I have copied and pasted here from Supabase. I'm not showing the whole thing, that's why I can reveal this here. And then to verify a user's bearer token, we want to pass in their token as the authorization for this call as well. So the authorization, and then the header is going to be json.headers.authorization. So it's going to fetch the authorization from our webhook, the Supabase token that was passed in, and then use that also as the authorization header for this HTTP call. And the URL that we want to go to, it's a GET request that goes to our project URL /auth/v1/user. And so this is going to return to us a valid user object as long as this Supabase bearer token that was given into this n8n workflow actually is assigned to a user. And so what that looks like here is I have this if statement, and basically if there is a valid user object that is returned, there's going to be an email attribute. And if there is an email attribute, that means that the authentication was successful. There are a lot of different ways to handle this, but yeah, you can just check on the email essentially, and that means that there's a valid user. And if there's not a valid user, we can return with an error. Otherwise, we can go on with the rest of our workflow exactly like we had before, and we still have the chat input and session ID parameters in the payload to do everything else that we need for this AI agent. The other thing that I want to mention very quickly, and that's really it, is that it's not necessarily ideal to just have your Supabase API key pasted as the parameter here. You could use another service like AWS Secrets Manager to store this in a more secure place and fetch that in the workflow and then pass that in as the value here. I just wanted something simple, but just keep in mind that there are ways to make this even more secure. It still is pretty secure overall as long as your n8n instance doesn't get hacked. So with that, that is everything that we have to change in the n8n workflow. I hope that this makes sense, how we are using this HTTP request against our project URL to verify the user. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions on that, but let's go ahead and dive right into taking the Claude Python code and updating our Streamlit app. So back in Visual Studio Code, I'm going to now take everything copied from Claude again and replace the file that I already had that just had the very basic authentication. And now in this case, I'm not going to go over all this code because it is looking perfect already. And so I'm just going to fill in the placeholders here, and then we'll run it and test it out again. And so again, I have another script that's up already that I'm just going to copy everything from. So your Supabase URL and anonymous authentication key, I already show how to get those. So you'll copy those over from your Supabase interface and paste them in here. And then the webhook URL is going to be the same if you just edited your workflow in place. Otherwise, just copy that. So I'm going to do that off camera and then come back once it is done. So you can see here that I have filled in all of my placeholder values. It's going to look pretty similar for you, and that is it. There's nothing else that I have to touch in the code. I know already that's working good because I did test it behind the scenes. So all you have to do to run it, I'll open up my terminal again. Again, just the same command, streamlit run n8n youtube agent.py, and then going back to my browser here, we now have this view that presents us with a login. And if I say something like test@gmail.com and some random password that's invalid, we get an error saying that it is invalid login credentials. Maybe we'd want to handle this error a little bit better. That doesn't look very good. And so there's obviously things you'll probably have to correct with Claude, but Claude is very good at correcting itself. But anyway, I'll refresh here and then I'll log in with something valid. So I'll say this is just kind of like a test account that I had created here. So I'll log in with this, click sign in, and it says login successful, but module Streamlit has no attribute experimental rerun. So this is something that I said Claude would hallucinate. So again, you kind of have to work with Claude a little bit. I'm keeping this in to show that like it's not perfect right off the bat, but Claude will correct itself. And so I can even go in here and say, don't include experimental stuff, and it'll correct itself. So I'm going to go through this with Claude and then come back once I have it fixed. All right, so I worked with it a little bit off camera and it corrected itself first try for the experimental reruns. And then I also had it fix up the UI a little bit as well. I, again, wanted to leave that there to show that it really is an iterative process to build these things with Claude. But when you have a model as powerful as Claude, it does a really good job correcting itself and not getting into an infinite loop of hallucination. And so with this, I'm going to enter in my credentials again with this little test account that that I have, and we can go ahead and test everything else. I'll go ahead and click login, and then boom, there we go. We got this beautiful interface that even shows me that I'm logged in with my email and my session ID too. And this is looking really, really nice. So now I can ask it the exact same question. What are the action items from the 8:25 meeting? And oh, nice. It's even got a loading bar here. This is looking really good. And it's got all of the Supabase verification behind the scenes in the workflow now. And there we go. Exact same answer as before. This is perfect. I hope that this gives you a huge head start for developing really nice interfaces for your n8n AI agents. There are a lot of opportunities to expand on this to give even more security or more robustness to your front end. But this is a really good head start, and I'm going to continue to make more and more content around n8n, even talking about other platforms like Open Web UI to work with front ends for your n8n agents as well. So if you're looking forward to that and you appreciate this content, I would really appreciate a like and a subscribe. And with that, I will see you in the next video.